"So please, don't undo my dress," said the Apache woman to the lone cowboy. Her voice was soft but firm, filled with a desperate plea as she lay there, bruised and broken from a brutal raid. As he leaned over her, his heart heavy with both guilt and responsibility, he wondered what had led her to this point. What had happened to her that made such a simple request feel like a life-or-death plea? The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. The cowboy, Samuel Clay, had seen it all. The bloodshed, the desperation, the broken lives of those who lived on the fringes of civilization. He had never cared much for the world around him. He was a man who kept to himself, a man whose only concern was surviving another day. But when he saw the woman, broken and battered, lying in the dirt, something inside him shifted. She had been left alone, abandoned by the very people who should have protected her. Her long black hair was tangled, and her once beautiful dress was torn and caked with blood. She was an Apache woman, her features sharp and fierce, but now her spirit seemed shattered, reduced to nothing more than a shell of a person. And yet, there was something about her that drew Samuel in, something that made him stop, despite every instinct telling him to keep riding. He dismounted and walked toward her cautiously. She didn't move, didn't try to run, but her eyes followed him as he knelt beside her. For a moment, they just looked at each other, neither of them speaking. Samuel could feel the weight of her gaze, as if she were trying to figure him out, trying to understand if he was another man who would treat her like a thing, like something to be discarded. "I'm not here to hurt you," Samuel said softly, his voice rough from years of solitude. "I'll help you." Her eyes widened slightly at his words, as though she hadn't heard such kindness in a long time. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words came out in a whisper. "Please, don't undo my dress." The plea was simple, but the way she said it, so full of vulnerability, pierced Samuel's heart. He didn't know what it was about her, but in that moment, he knew one thing for sure. His life was about to change. Samuel Clay looked down at the Apache woman, his hands instinctively flexing as he tried to decide what to do next. He had seen enough of life's cruelty to know when someone needed help, but he had never been good at offering more than what was necessary. He had a reputation, a man who didn't get involved, a man who preferred to keep moving. But something about her, the way she lay there in the dust, broken and still, made him want to stay. He could feel it in his bones. This moment, this encounter, wasn't something he could walk away from. Her dark eyes, wide and full of something unreadable, met his as he knelt beside her. The sun had set, and the air was cool now, but the pain she had endured still radiated from her. She was bruised, her clothes torn, and the fear in her eyes seemed like a permanent fixture, as if she had learned not to trust anyone or anything anymore. "Please," she whispered again, her voice barely audible, a tremble in her words. "Don't undo my dress." Samuel's heart tightened at the sound of her voice, filled with both defiance and despair. He wasn't sure why she said it, but there was something in the way she spoke that made him pause. Was it shame? Was she asking him not to strip her of her dignity, even in her broken state? Or was it a plea, something deeper, that spoke of the loss of something far more precious than clothes? He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had the power to help her, to pull her from this hell she had fallen into. But how much help could he give? How much could he offer before he became just another man who broke her down? "I'm not here to hurt you," Samuel repeated softly, trying to ease her fears. "I'm just trying to help." Her lips parted, and for a moment he thought she might say something, but instead she just nodded weakly, her eyes filled with a quiet gratitude and an unease that mirrored his own. She didn't trust him, and he didn't blame her. Trust was earned, not given, especially after what she had likely been through. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" Samuel said, not expecting an answer but feeling the need to say it anyway. He couldn't imagine what she had experienced, but he could see the signs of violence on her body, the exhaustion in her face, the hollowed look of someone who had survived far too much to believe in the goodness of others. The woman, her name still unknown to him, finally spoke again, this time her voice stronger, though still laced with the remnants of fear. "I have learned that no one offers help without a price, and I have nothing left to give." Samuel's jaw tightened, and he lowered his head. He had heard these words too many times in his life. He had heard them from men who had been betrayed, from women who had been abused, from children who had lost everything. But for some reason, hearing it from her made him feel the weight of her suffering more than any words had before. "No one's asking for anything from you," Samuel said, his voice steady but softer now. "I'm not like the others, I won't hurt you." She didn't respond, but there was a slight shift in her posture, a subtle change, like a small crack opening in the wall she had built around herself. He reached out slowly, carefully, not wanting to make any sudden movements that might frighten her. He took her hand in his, the touch light and respectful, offering what little comfort he could. "I can't let you stay here," Samuel said, his voice resolute. "You'll die if I leave you." She looked at him then, her eyes studying his face with a mix of suspicion and something else, something that might have been hope, buried deep under layers of pain. He could see it in the way she didn't pull her hand away, how she let him help her without a word of protest. It was a small victory, but it felt like enough for now. "I can't go with you," she said after a long pause. Her voice was quiet, but there was a finality to it that made Samuel's chest tighten. "I'm not who you think I am." Samuel didn't press her for more details. He had learned not to push people who weren't ready to talk. He could see that she was hiding something, that there was more to her story than what she was willing to share. But for now, it didn't matter. He didn't need to know her past, to know that she needed help. She needed someone who wouldn't judge her for what had happened to her, someone who wouldn't treat her like an object or a victim. She needed someone who would give her the chance to heal, in whatever way that meant. "I'm not asking for your story," Samuel said, his voice softening. "I'm just asking for your trust. Let me help you." Her eyes held his for a long moment, and for the first time, she seemed to search his face, as if looking for any sign of insincerity. She didn't find it. There was nothing in him but a quiet, steady resolve, a promise that he would do whatever it took to help her, even if it meant walking through the fire with her. Slowly, cautiously, she nodded, and for the first time since he had found her, her lips curled into a faint, fragile smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a start. "All right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll go with you." Samuel stood, pulling her gently to her feet. She was weak, but the small movement was a sign of something more, something he hadn't expected. In that moment, he realized that the fight ahead wouldn't just be about survival. It would be about healing, about giving her the chance to live a life she had almost lost. It wasn't going to be easy. It was going to be a long road, filled with obstacles they would both have to face together. But for the first time in a long time, Samuel felt like maybe, just maybe, there was something worth fighting for. The journey ahead was long, and every step they took felt heavier than the last. The sun had dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the flat land. They were heading toward the nearest town, a place where they could find shelter, food, and maybe some peace. But peace, as Samuel had learned over the years, was fleeting. It was something you chased and never quite caught. As they rode, the silence between them settled into an uneasy rhythm. The Apache woman, still nameless, though Samuel couldn't bring himself to think of her as just the Apache woman, rode beside him, her eyes distant as though she were somewhere far from the present. She had barely spoken since agreeing to ride with him, her mind clearly occupied with something darker, something too painful to express. Samuel, for his part, had his own demons to contend with. His life had been one of isolation, a man with a gun and nothing left to lose, until this moment, this strange, unexpected encounter. He didn't know why he had stopped for her, why he had chosen to help her. In his past he would have kept riding, the dusty roads always beckoning him forward, away from anything that might demand more of him. But now, with her beside him, he couldn't help but feel that this wasn't just some chance encounter. It was a test of his humanity, of his soul, and of whether he could still care. The moonlight was bright against the barren landscape as they continued on their way, their horses' hooves echoing in the quiet night. Samuel stole a glance at her, studying her closely for the first time since they had started traveling together. She was holding herself differently now, the stiffness in her posture slowly giving way to something more vulnerable. Her long black hair, once tangled with blood and dirt, now flowed freely in the wind, and her torn dress fluttered in the breeze like a flag of surrender. Her face, however, remained hard, her features set in a permanent mask of resistance. She hadn't looked at him directly since they had left the wreckage of her village, and Samuel wondered what she was thinking. Was she plotting her escape? Did she think he was like the others, someone who would eventually hurt her, take advantage of her kindness? Samuel couldn't be sure, but he knew that trust wasn't something that could be earned in a day. It wasn't something you could demand or expect from someone who had seen the cruelty of the world firsthand. The moonlight shone brighter as the land began to change. They were leaving the open desert behind, approaching a patch of scattered trees and a creek that cut through the valley like a ribbon of water. They slowed their horses, the sound of the creek gently filling the silence. "We should rest here," Samuel suggested, guiding his horse toward the edge of the water. "We'll have a better chance of making it to town by morning." The Apache woman didn't reply, but she followed his lead, guiding her horse to the water's edge. As they dismounted, the cold air of the evening brushed against them, bringing a slight chill to their skin. Samuel unstrapped his bedroll, preparing for the night ahead, while the woman slowly slid off her horse, her movements stiff. As she began to tend to her own horse, Samuel took a moment to examine her more closely. Her skin was dark, weathered by the sun, and though she had the unmistakable strength of her people, there was a delicate fragility to her, like something on the verge of breaking. She caught him looking, her sharp eyes flashing toward him for a brief moment, but it was enough for her to see that he was studying her. The brief glance was all he needed to know that she hadn't forgotten what she had been through, what she had lost. She hadn't forgotten that he was a stranger, and in a world where trust was a luxury few could afford, that was a truth she held close. Samuel sighed, looking at the sky, the stars scattered across the night like shards of broken glass. He didn't have the answers she was looking for. He wasn't a man of great wisdom or insight. He wasn't a hero. He was a man who had seen the world burn around him, a man who had learned to live in the ashes. But something about her, about the way she had looked at him when he had first found her, made him believe that maybe he could still find something worth fighting for, something worth saving. "I know you're not ready to trust me," he said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was rough, a little unsure, but it was all he could offer. "But you don't have to carry this alone." She didn't respond right away, and for a moment he thought she hadn't heard him. But then she spoke, her voice low, carrying the weight of something heavy. "You don't know what I've been through," she said, her words cutting through the air like a knife. "I've had to survive alone for so long. No one's ever come to help. No one ever stays." Samuel didn't try to argue with her. He didn't need to. He understood the bitterness in her words. He had lived with his own loneliness for as long as he could remember. The difference between them was that he hadn't had to survive like she had. He hadn't been forced to fight for his life every single day, to survive in a world that constantly tried to break him. She had, and that made her different from everyone else. "I'm not leaving," Samuel said, his voice firm. "I'll see you to safety, even if I have to drag you there myself." For a brief moment her eyes softened, and Samuel saw something in them that he hadn't seen before. Vulnerability. It was fleeting, like a candle flickering in the wind, but it was there. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to, but in that moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a beginning. As they sat by the fire that night, the desert still and silent around them, Samuel couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead for them. He didn't know where the road would take them, didn't know what kind of future they would find. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, it didn't matter. They had each other, and that might be enough to survive whatever came next. The fire crackled between them, the warmth of the flames flickering against the night's chill. But the silence between Samuel and the Apache woman remained thick, almost suffocating. As the hours passed, the desert stretched out before them, its vast emptiness reflecting the distance between them, a gulf that neither of them seemed able to cross. Samuel had set up the camp, but as the firelight danced on the rocks, he found himself lost in thought, his gaze following the flames as they swayed in the wind. He had saved her, but he hadn't saved her from the ghosts that haunted her, the ones that had driven her into this desolate land. He had no way of knowing how deeply those scars ran, how far her trust had been shattered. Beside him, the Apache woman sat, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the ground. She had barely touched the food he had offered her, the stew now cold beside her. Her thoughts, like his, seemed miles away. She was lost in something, something he couldn't reach. "You don't have to talk," Samuel said after a long stretch of quiet. His voice was low, careful, as if testing the waters. "I'm not asking for your story." The woman didn't look at him, didn't even flinch at the sound of his voice. She simply kept staring into the fire, as if it held the answers to questions she hadn't voiced. Samuel continued, trying to fill the silence. "But if you ever want to tell it, I'll listen. I don't know what you've been through. I don't know your pain, but I know what it's like to lose everything, to feel like the world has forgotten you. I don't want that for you." Her hand twitched slightly on her lap, but she remained silent. Samuel sighed, rubbing his neck as he stared out into the night. There was a weight to her silence, a refusal to let him in, and yet something about the way she held herself, her quiet strength, her defiance, made him want to keep trying. The wind picked up, and Samuel glanced around at the horizon, as though expecting something to appear from the dark shadows, but it was just the desert, empty and silent, stretching endlessly. Nara's voice finally broke the silence, her words soft but sharp. "You don't understand, you can't—" Samuel turned to face her, his curiosity piqued. He had been waiting for her to speak, but the words she had chosen were heavier than he had expected. "Maybe I don't," he said, his voice gentle, "but I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him. Then, her eyes dark and filled with something he couldn't quite place. "You don't get to decide that," she said, the edge in her voice catching him off guard. "No one does. People like you. You always leave. You don't stay." Samuel's chest tightened at the sting of her words. He had heard it all before, but coming from her it hit harder than it ever had. "I'm not like the others," he replied, a roughness creeping into his voice. "I don't run. I've got nothing left to run to, no place to go." She scoffed softly, a bitter sound. "You think you're different? You think you're the only one with nothing left to lose?" She shook her head, eyes glistening in the firelight. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything." Samuel felt a pang of guilt in his gut. Maybe he didn't know. He had lost his family, his future, and yet there was something about the way she said it that made him feel small. He wasn't used to this kind of pain, the kind that made a person shut themselves off from the world, the kind that made them expect betrayal before kindness. "I'm not here to take anything from you," Samuel said quietly, "and I'm not asking for anything in return. But I'm not leaving you here. Not like this." Her eyes flickered, and for the first time since he had met her, he saw a hint of something softer beneath the hardness in her gaze. Maybe it was doubt, or maybe it was the faintest flicker of hope, but it was enough for him to press on. "You're not alone," he repeated, leaning in slightly. "You don't have to go through this by yourself." For a long moment, Nara didn't speak. Instead, she sat there, her eyes staring into the flames. Samuel waited, giving her the space she needed. He could feel the battle within her, her desire to trust, to let go of the fear that had defined her for so long. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer this time. "I've never trusted anyone, not since I was a child. They took everything from me, Samuel, my family, my people, everything." Samuel felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. She had lost more than he could ever understand, but that didn't mean he couldn't help her. "I'm sorry," Samuel said simply, his voice heavy with sympathy. "I can't change what happened to you. I can't undo the past. But I can help you move forward, and maybe we can find a way to heal together." Nara was silent again, her eyes still fixed on the fire. But this time, there was no bitterness in her gaze. There was no anger, just quiet, tentative acceptance. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said softly, her voice breaking the air between them. "But I'm willing to try." That was enough for Samuel. He didn't need her to forgive him or forget her pain. He just needed her to know she wasn't alone anymore. They would face whatever came next together, as equals, no more, no less. And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. He believed they might have a chance. The next morning, the sun rose over the horizon, casting a warm, golden light across the vast desert landscape. The sky was clear, the air crisp and still. It was a perfect morning to begin the next leg of their journey, but the weight of the night before lingered. Samuel could feel it in the air between him and Nara, an unspoken understanding, a fragile thread of trust that had begun to form. They packed up quickly, the tasks done in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the unspoken promises they had made, to survive, to move forward, to fight whatever demons followed them. Samuel saddled their horses, checking the gear and making sure everything was ready for the ride. Nara was quieter than usual, her face hidden behind a veil of contemplation. She wasn't looking at him as she mounted her horse, but he could see the stiffness in her posture. She was still a mystery, a woman burdened by more than just the scars on her skin. There were scars beneath the surface, ones that weren't as easily healed as a simple wound. And Samuel knew deep down that the road ahead would be as much about helping her heal those scars as it would be about getting her to safety. He didn't know where they were headed, didn't know where the road would take them, but he knew one thing: they couldn't stay here. This desert was a place that had taken too much from them already. They rode through the morning, the sun climbing higher, its heat pressing down on them like a heavy weight. They didn't speak much, but there was something different in the way Nara rode beside him now. She wasn't as guarded. Her movements had become a little more relaxed, though still sharp and cautious, like a fox always aware of the hunter lurking in the shadows. It wasn't a transformation, not yet, but it was progress. By midday, the landscape began to change. The dry, cracked earth was replaced by scrubby bushes and the faint outline of distant mountains in the distance. Samuel could see the faint silhouette of a town on the horizon. The town wasn't much, just a handful of buildings, a saloon and a few scattered homes, but it was a sign of civilization, a place where they could rest, resupply, and maybe, just maybe, find some answers. Samuel wasn't sure what to expect from the town. He had learned not to trust the small settlements. They were often full of people who didn't care about anything beyond their own survival. But the fact that it was there, a small speck of civilization in a sea of emptiness, gave him a sense of hope. Nara hadn't said anything since the ride started, and Samuel wasn't sure if she was even paying attention to the town ahead. But as they rode closer, he saw her posture shift slightly. Her eyes flicked toward the town, and for a brief moment, he saw something in her expression, something that told him she wasn't ready to trust it, wasn't ready to let her guard down completely. "They won't care that we're passing through," Samuel said, trying to ease the tension he saw in her body. "We'll get what we need and keep moving." Nara didn't respond, but she nodded once. A sharp, stiff movement. Samuel knew she was preparing herself for whatever might come next. She wasn't foolish. She knew that this town could bring danger as easily as it could offer sanctuary. As they approached, the town began to take shape, the buildings coming into clearer view. It wasn't much: dusty roads, a few weathered houses, and a small general store that looked like it had been there for decades. The town wasn't a place for excitement or luxury. It was a place for people who had nowhere else to go. Samuel led the way into the town, keeping his horse steady and his eyes scanning the area. The streets were quiet, almost too quiet. A few people stood by the saloon, eyeing them as they rode by. A couple of children played by a well, but they stopped when they saw the strangers coming. The moment felt tense, as if the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. There was no immediate threat, no sign of violence or hostility. It was just a quiet, lonely place, the kind of town people came to when they wanted to escape something or someone. Samuel turned his attention to the general store, the only building that seemed to have any sign of life. He glanced at Nara, who was watching the town with wary eyes. "We'll grab what we need and head out," he said, his tone steady. "No need to make ourselves targets." Nara didn't say anything, but she gave a brief nod. Samuel could see the tension in her eyes, the unease that came with being in a place full of strangers. She was always one step ahead, always calculating, always waiting for the worst to happen. As they dismounted, Samuel led the horses to a nearby hitching post, tying them up securely. The shopkeeper, a grizzled man in his 50s, emerged from the store. He looked them over, his gaze lingering on Nara for a moment longer than it did on Samuel. There was something in his eyes that made Samuel uncomfortable, something that told him this man had seen more than his fair share of trouble. "What can I get you?" the shopkeeper asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. He wiped his hands on a rag, glancing at the horses, then back at them. "We need supplies," Samuel said, his voice low and even. "Water, food, anything that'll get us back on the road." The shopkeeper nodded and led them inside, where the shelves were stocked with dried meats, cans of beans, and sacks of flour. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them going for a few days. As Samuel moved to grab the supplies, he noticed the shopkeeper's gaze fall on Nara again, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Where you two headed?" the man asked, his voice casual, but there was an edge to it. Nara stiffened, her hand moving to the knife at her side, but she didn't make any move to draw it. Samuel glanced at her, his expression calm, and then he turned back to the shopkeeper. "We're just passing through," Samuel replied, his tone firm. "Nothing to be concerned about." The shopkeeper didn't push it further. He simply nodded, packing the supplies quickly into a canvas bag. There was a tension in the air, a knowledge that neither of them belonged here, but they weren't going to make trouble. At least, not yet. Once they paid, Samuel turned to Nara. She was already standing near the door, her back stiff, her eyes scanning the town like a hawk. She was ready to leave, and Samuel didn't blame her. He could feel the town watching them as they mounted their horses again, the weight of the unspoken lingering between them. They had what they needed. Now they just had to keep moving. As they rode out of the town, the sun beginning its descent once more, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The quiet of the place had a certain weight to it, like everyone was waiting for something. But he had learned long ago not to dwell on the unknown. They had survived this far. That was enough for today. The road out of town was long and dry, the sun casting long, harsh shadows over the barren desert. The air was thick with heat, and the silence between Samuel and Nara had returned, more palpable than ever. There was a certain unease now, a quiet tension that hung in the air between them, and Samuel couldn't help but feel it. They had come to the town for supplies, but the town had given them more than that. It had given them a glimpse of what they could become, two strangers, running from their pasts, moving from place to place with no real purpose. He had hoped that stopping for a moment of rest, of normalcy, might have been a temporary reprieve, but the town had only reminded him of what he already knew, that they couldn't stay anywhere for too long. The road was their only home. Nara rode ahead of him, her expression unreadable. She had said little since they left the general store, her mind clearly elsewhere. Samuel didn't push her for conversation. He didn't need to. He knew what it was like to be lost in your own thoughts, to carry a weight that no one else could understand. The landscape around them stretched endlessly, the desert providing little relief. There were no hills to climb, no rocks to hide behind, just miles of dry, cracked earth. Samuel could feel the heat bearing down on them, making the air shimmer in the distance. The sound of their horses' hooves on the dirt was the only thing that broke the silence. Nara's horse slowed slightly, and Samuel followed her lead, bringing his own horse to a halt. He watched as she scanned the horizon, her sharp eyes catching every detail. There was a quiet strength in her, something that told him she had been through more than most people could imagine. Her survival wasn't just about her ability to fight or to flee, it was about her ability to endure, to live through the things that would have broken most people. "We can't keep running like this," Nara said suddenly, breaking the silence with a quiet and almost resigned voice. Samuel looked at her, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Her gaze didn't leave the horizon, but she seemed to gather her thoughts before speaking. "This life, the constant moving, the endless fight for survival. It's wearing me down, Samuel, I can feel it, and I don't know how much longer I can keep doing it." Samuel's heart tightened at her words. He had known that Nara was carrying something heavy, but hearing it out loud, hearing the toll it had taken on her, made it feel all the more real. He didn't want to admit it, but he felt the same. The road, the endless days of running, the constant fight. He was tired of it too, but he wasn't ready to stop. Not yet. "I know," Samuel said softly, his voice a little hoarse. "I feel the same way, but we don't have any other choice. Not yet." Nara's eyes flicked toward him, and for the first time in a while, he saw something in her gaze, something close to understanding, but also something more. It was a quiet acceptance of the truth. They didn't have a choice. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't as heavy. There was something unspoken between them now, a mutual recognition that neither of them could run forever. After a long moment, Nara spoke again, her voice steady. "You don't have to keep doing this for me, Samuel. You don't owe me anything." Samuel shook his head, his expression hardening. "I'm not doing this for you," he said, his voice firm. "I'm doing this because I don't know how to walk away from what's right. You may not trust me, but I'm not leaving you here. Not after everything." Nara didn't respond immediately, but her eyes softened, just a little. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, something that looked like gratitude, maybe even relief. "I don't trust easily," she said quietly, her words careful. "I've been betrayed too many times to believe that anyone truly cares." Samuel understood the weight of her words, more than she knew. Trust was something that had to be earned. It wasn't something you gave away freely, especially not after you'd been burned too many times. "I know you don't trust me," Samuel said, his voice steady, "but I'm not asking for your trust. I'm asking for a chance for us to move forward together. If you don't want that, I understand, but I'm not leaving." There was a long pause as Nara considered his words. The wind blew across the desert, carrying with it the scent of dust and dried earth. She glanced at him once more, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment. "All right," she said quietly, the words almost lost in the wind. "But I won't promise anything." Samuel didn't need her to promise anything. In that moment, her words were enough. They were a starting point, the first real step towards something more than just survival. He didn't know where this road would take them. He didn't know if they could ever find peace, but he knew one thing: they had a chance. Together. "I don't need promises," he said softly. "I just need you to know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." The silence between them had shifted again, but this time it was different. There was no longer an edge of distrust or fear. It was a silence of understanding. Of two people who, despite everything they had been through, still had the strength to fight for something more. They continued to ride through the desert, the vast emptiness surrounding them, but for the first time, it didn't feel as lonely. They weren't alone anymore, not really. And that, for now, was enough. The sun was beginning to set as they continued their journey, casting a deep orange glow over the desert landscape. The dry earth beneath them was cracked and lifeless, but the air had cooled, bringing with it a welcome relief. Samuel kept his eyes on the horizon, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on Nara, on the words they had shared, and the uneasy understanding that had settled between them. It was clear that they had both been running from something, though they had yet to speak of it in full. The trust they had begun to build wasn't strong enough to face their pasts. Not yet. But Samuel knew that the longer they kept moving, the more they would be forced to confront it. You couldn't outrun what you carried inside of you. Not for long. Nara had grown quieter since their brief conversation, her face hard once more as she rode ahead of him. She was a woman who had learned to survive alone, and while she had given him a glimpse of her vulnerability, it was clear that she wasn't ready to share her story completely. He wasn't surprised. People like her didn't open up easily, but he was starting to see the cracks in her armor, little moments where the walls she had built around herself faltered, just enough for him to see who she really was. And he understood. Samuel's life had been defined by solitude, by the choices he had made to push others away, to shield himself from the pain of connection. But now, with Nara by his side, he couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, he could choose a different path, a path where he didn't have to walk alone. The soft crunch of hooves on gravel brought him out of his thoughts. Ahead, the outline of another town began to emerge from the dusk, nestled in the valley between two hills. It was small, a cluster of buildings half hidden by the shadows, but it was enough to offer hope. They needed to rest, to gather supplies, and to prepare for the next part of their journey. Nara didn't look back at him as they approached the town, but Samuel could tell by the way she held herself that she wasn't thrilled about the idea of stopping. She had made it clear that she wasn't one for lingering in places where people might recognize her, where she could be exposed. The fear was still there, buried beneath her stoic exterior. "You ready?" Samuel asked, keeping his voice low. Nara didn't answer immediately, but after a beat, she nodded. "We'll be in and out. No fuss, no talking." Samuel didn't argue. He had learned to move quietly, to blend into the background when necessary. The last thing they needed was attention, especially now. They slowed their horses as they entered the town, their eyes scanning the surroundings. The streets were empty, save for a few townsfolk moving between buildings and the distant sound of a fiddle playing in a nearby saloon. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, but nothing too exciting ever happened. Samuel had a feeling that was exactly the kind of place they needed. No questions asked, just get what they needed and move on. They dismounted in front of a small general store, its windows dusty and covered with faded signs advertising basic goods, rations, clothing, and the occasional tool. The store was quiet, the bell above the door jingling as they stepped inside. A man behind the counter looked up from a pile of papers, his eyes narrowing as he assessed them. He was older, probably in his 60s, with graying hair and a gruff expression. He didn't seem surprised to see strangers, but his gaze lingered on Nara for just a moment too long before he returned to his work. "What can I get you?" he asked, his voice gravelly, but not unfriendly. "We're just passing through," Samuel said, his tone casual. "We need supplies, water, food, maybe some medical supplies, whatever you got." The storekeeper nodded, motioning to the shelves behind him. "Help yourself. Prices are marked. Pay when you're done." Samuel moved toward the shelves, grabbing a few bags of dried meat, a couple of water skins, and a small kit of bandages. He couldn't help but glance back at Nara, who was standing near the door, her posture rigid as she surveyed the street outside. It was obvious she was on high alert, always watching, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. The weight of the past clung to her like a shadow. Samuel could feel it. It was a silence that spoke of pain, of survival at any cost. But this was different. He wasn't just watching her from the outside anymore. He was part of it too. And if they were going to survive, They were going to have to face the things they had buried. "You all right?" Samuel asked quietly, stepping toward her with the supplies. She didn't look at him, but her voice was soft, tinged with something he couldn't place. "I'm fine," but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a vulnerability that she didn't want him to see. It was brief, gone before he could catch it fully. And for the first time since he had met her, Samuel realized just how much she was holding back, how much she was trying to protect herself from him and the world around her. He didn't push. He knew better than that. The words she wasn't saying were hers to share when she was ready, and not a moment sooner. Instead, he placed the supplies on the counter, nodding at the shopkeeper to finish the transaction. As they headed back toward the horses, the sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting a golden light across the town. The quiet evening was still, the air filled with the soft rustling of trees and the distant sound of people talking. For a brief moment, it felt almost like peace, but they both knew better than to trust it. Samuel mounted his horse first, followed by Nara, who climbed into the saddle with practiced ease. As they began to ride out of town, the town fading behind them like a memory, Samuel felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation. They had what they needed, but the road ahead was long. There was always something waiting for them around the corner. The night stretched out before them, endless and open, but Samuel didn't feel the weight of the world on his shoulders quite as much as before. For the first time, he felt like maybe they could make it. Maybe, if they kept going, they could find something more than just survival. Maybe they could find something worth living for. The landscape around them began to change as the day wore on, the earth beneath their horses' hooves turning from dry, cracked dirt to rough or uneven stone. The sun hung lower in the sky now, the orange and purple hues of twilight stretching across the horizon like a painter's brushstroke. Samuel kept his eyes ahead, his gaze scanning the vast emptiness of the desert. He could feel the weight of the journey pressing down on him, but there was something different now, something he hadn't expected. Beside him, Nara rode silently, her eyes distant, her face unreadable. She hadn't spoken much since they left the town, and Samuel didn't know whether that was because she was deep in thought or just because she didn't trust the moment of peace. He didn't trust it either, but they couldn't stop. Not yet. There was a tension in the air, a quiet undercurrent that made every movement feel heavier, every sound more pronounced. Samuel could hear the distant cry of a coyote, the faint rustle of dry grass as the wind picked up, and even the soft snort of Nara's horse as it trotted alongside his own. But beyond those sounds, there was an unsettling stillness, like the calm before a storm. As they rode on, Samuel felt a flicker of something else, a sense of unease that he couldn't shake. He knew the road ahead was dangerous. It always was. But now, more than ever, he couldn't help but wonder what it was they were truly running from. Were they running from their pasts? Or from something more, something neither of them was ready to face? The wind began to pick up, and with it, the temperature started to drop. Nara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her movements slow and deliberate. The fire of the day was gone now, replaced by the biting chill of the desert night. Samuel glanced at her, wondering if she was as unsettled as he was, but she didn't seem to notice. She was always the one who carried herself like nothing ever fazed her, or maybe that was just what she wanted everyone else to think. "Do you ever stop running?" Nara's voice broke the silence, and Samuel turned to her, surprised at the question. He hadn't expected her to speak, especially not after the tense quiet between them since leaving the town. Her question wasn't just out of curiosity. It was deeper, more personal. It was a question about her, about him, about the road they were both walking. Samuel didn't answer right away. He thought about it for a moment, his hand resting lightly on the reins as he let the question settle in his mind. "No," he said finally, his voice low. "I don't think we ever do." Nara didn't respond, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, as though she was considering his words. Samuel glanced at her again, but this time he could see the tension in her shoulders, the strain in her jaw. It was as if the question had opened a door, one she had closed long ago, and now the weight of it was settling in on her. The silence stretched between them again, but this time it didn't feel like a barrier. It felt more like two people who had spent too much of their lives alone, standing side by side for the first time, struggling to understand what it meant to trust someone again. "We're both running," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "From different things, but we're both running." Samuel didn't know how to respond. He had always thought of himself as a man with no future, someone who had left the past behind him and didn't look back. But now, with Nara beside him, he realized that maybe that wasn't the whole truth. Maybe he was running from something deeper, something he didn't know how to face. "Maybe we don't have to run anymore," he said, his voice quieter now. "Maybe we can stop for a little while." The words felt foreign coming from him. He wasn't the kind of man who believed in stopping. He had spent his life moving forward, not letting himself get bogged down by emotions, by attachments. But for some reason, with Nara, he couldn't shake the feeling that this time it was different. Nara didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The quiet understanding between them was enough. The road stretched on, the landscape shifting again as they rode further into the valley. The shadows of the mountains loomed ahead, their jagged peaks silhouetted against the darkening sky. Samuel didn't know how long they had been riding or how much further they had to go. But in that moment, it didn't matter. They were together, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. As they rode on, the world around them seemed to fade into the distance. The desert stretched out before them, vast and empty, but somehow it didn't feel as lonely anymore. With Nara at his side, Samuel felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something more than survival. They didn't know what the future held, but for the first time they were facing it together. The night stretched on, and with it, the miles between them and the world they had left behind. The moon hung high in the sky now, casting its pale light across the desert, turning the landscape into a strange, otherworldly place. Samuel and Nara rode in silence, their horses moving in rhythm, the only sound the soft clopping of hooves on the hard ground and the occasional whistle of the wind. As they moved deeper into the valley, the air grew colder, the chill of night settling in with a quiet finality. Nara had wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders, her face turned into the wind, her dark eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for something, or perhaps trying to block out the silence. Samuel couldn't tell which, but he knew she was still holding something back. She always was. His own mind was clouded with thoughts he hadn't been able to shake since that conversation earlier. The idea of stopping, of resting, of not running had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. For most of his life, he had kept moving, kept his head down, and kept fighting. It was easier that way. But now, with Nara beside him, he wasn't sure anymore. Could he stop? Could he let go of the ghosts of the past long enough to find peace? He glanced at her again. She was so different from him in many ways. Strong, silent, fiercely independent. But there was something about her, something raw and vulnerable, that had made him stop that day in the desert, something he couldn't ignore. And the more time he spent with her, the more he wondered if he had finally found someone who understood the weight of what it meant to carry a broken past. "Do you ever think about what comes after this?" Nara's voice broke through his thoughts, her tone low, almost as if she were speaking to herself. Samuel looked at her, his brow furrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" "After all of this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "After we've run as far as we can, what happens then? Will we ever be able to stop running?" The question hit him harder than he expected. It was the same one he had been asking himself, but hearing her voice it aloud made it feel more real, more pressing. For the first time, he wasn't sure how to answer. Could they ever stop? Could they ever find a place where they could truly be free from the ghosts that haunted them? He didn't respond immediately, unsure of what to say, but as he watched her ride ahead, her shoulders set with quiet determination, he realized that this wasn't just about survival anymore. This wasn't just about getting from one place to the next. It was about something more. It was about finding a way forward, together. "I don't know," Samuel said, his voice steady, "but I think we have a chance. We don't have to keep running. Not forever." Nara glanced back at him then, her eyes sharp, searching. It was the first time she had really looked at him since they left the town, and there was something in her gaze, something uncertain, something that told him she didn't quite believe him. And why should she? She had spent her life surviving on her own. Trust wasn't something that came easy for people like her. "We're both broken," Nara said softly, her words almost lost to the wind. "I don't know if we can fix each other." Samuel nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. They weren't just speaking about their physical wounds, the cuts and bruises that could be treated with medicine and care. They were speaking about something deeper, something that couldn't be healed with a simple gesture or kind words. There were scars, deep scars, that ran through them both, and they were both still carrying them. "We're not trying to fix each other," Samuel said, his voice low but firm. "I think we're just trying to stay alive, and maybe, just maybe, we can do that together." The words hung between them like a promise, a fragile one, but one nonetheless. They didn't need to save each other. They didn't need to heal every wound, every scar. But maybe, just maybe, they could offer each other something more valuable, the chance to keep moving forward, to find something worth holding on to. Nara didn't say anything, but she gave him a small nod, the first sign of agreement he had seen from her in days. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. They continued their ride in silence, the landscape now shifting as they passed through an area of rocky outcrops and scattered vegetation. The shadows of the mountains ahead seemed closer now, the road narrowing as they moved deeper into the valley. They were getting closer to the next town, but Samuel wasn't thinking about the town anymore. He was thinking about what Nara had said. What came after this? What happened when the road finally ran out? They couldn't outrun their pasts forever, but maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to. Maybe there was something in the journey itself, something that could keep them both moving forward, even if they never reached the end. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Samuel felt a flicker of hope, one he hadn't expected. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were beginning to live, even if it was just for this moment, in the company of someone who understood the cost of survival. And that, for now, was enough. The sun was dipping lower, casting an amber glow over the rugged landscape, and the cool evening breeze stirred the air, bringing with it the promise of relief. Samuel's thoughts were still tangled with Nara's words, the weight of her question pressing down on him like a stone. What came after this? After they had run far enough, could they ever really escape the ghosts of their pasts, or would they chase them forever? The silence between them had become companionable, not uncomfortable as they rode side by side. Nara's gaze was ahead, but her face held an expression that Samuel had come to recognize, a quiet resolve. She was a woman who didn't expect promises or comforts, someone who had learned to rely only on herself. She wasn't ready to put her trust in anyone else, and yet, despite the walls she had built around herself, he knew something had shifted. The journey they were on, the road ahead, felt like it could lead to something different. He wasn't sure what that was yet, but he could feel it, like a pulse under the surface, something waiting to be uncovered. The town ahead was coming into view now, its silhouette standing stark against the backdrop of mountains. It wasn't much more than a collection of adobe buildings, weathered and worn by time and the desert's harsh elements. But it was a place that could offer them a rest, a place to resupply before they continued on their way. Samuel wasn't sure what to expect when they reached the town. It wasn't a place for excitement or strangers. Towns like these were always filled with wary eyes, people who didn't welcome outsiders, especially those who didn't fit the mold. But they needed to stop. The horses were tired, their bodies worn from the long journey, and both Samuel and Nara were beginning to feel the effects of days spent under the brutal sun. They needed food, water, and rest. They couldn't keep moving indefinitely. As they drew closer to the town, the sound of a distant bell echoed in the air, signaling the end of the day and the beginning of evening's quiet. A few people walked along the streets, but they kept their distance, their eyes flicking toward the two strangers on horseback. Samuel could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken judgment that always came when outsiders wandered into a small, tight-knit community. But it didn't matter. They weren't here to stay. They were here to get what they needed and move on. "We'll be quick," Samuel said, glancing over at Nara. She didn't look back at him but gave a slight nod in acknowledgement. The town was quiet, and the silence between them felt heavier than before, like something was about to happen. They moved quickly through the narrow streets, eyes on the storefronts and the few scattered people. Samuel had seen enough of these places to know that the less attention they attracted, the better. There was always someone who would ask too many questions, someone who would pry into things best left unanswered. As they approached the general store, Samuel motioned for Nara to stay back, out of sight of the windows. The last thing they needed was unnecessary attention. He walked in first, giving the shopkeeper a brief nod as he approached the counter. "Just the basics," Samuel said, his voice low and purposeful. "Water, dried meat, a few cans of beans. Nothing too much." The shopkeeper, an older man with a thick beard and a weathered face, looked up at him with a hard expression, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he gestured to the shelves behind him, his eyes lingering briefly on Samuel's face before he turned back to his work. The air in the store felt thick with tension, and Samuel could feel the weight of the shopkeeper's gaze, the quiet judgment that followed them even in the smallest of towns. He gathered the supplies quickly, trying to make the exchange as brief as possible. The last thing they needed was a confrontation, and the sooner they could get out of here, the better. As he approached the counter to pay, the shopkeeper's eyes flicked to the door where Nara was standing, her figure half hidden in the shadows. For a brief moment, the man's gaze lingered on her, and Samuel could see the judgment in his eyes. There was no mistaking it. People like Nara, like them, weren't always welcome in towns like this, and the shopkeeper knew exactly who she was. "You know the rules," the man muttered under his breath, his voice low but filled with a certain knowing. "People like her, they don't last long around here." Samuel froze, the words cutting through the air like a knife. He knew exactly what the man was talking about, and it made his blood run cold. This town might have been quiet, but it had its own set of rules, its own understanding of who belonged and who didn't. People like Nara, Apache women, people from her tribe, didn't always find safe refuge in places like this. "Don't worry about her," Samuel said, his voice hardening. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the money, slamming it onto the counter. "We won't be here long." The shopkeeper didn't say another word, just gave a sharp nod as he bagged the supplies and handed them over. Samuel took them without hesitation, not wanting to give the man any more of his attention than necessary. He turned and walked out of the store, the heavy weight of the shopkeeper's words still hanging in the air behind him. As he stepped back outside, he saw Nara standing just a few feet away, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She had heard everything. "They don't like us here," Nara said quietly, her voice tinged with both bitterness and resignation. Samuel glanced at her, his expression hardening. "No one likes anyone who doesn't fit in," he said, his voice low. "But we don't need their approval." Nara didn't respond, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Maybe it was acceptance. Maybe it was anger. But whatever it was, it only lasted a moment before she turned her attention back to the road ahead. They weren't going to stay here long. Samuel knew that. There was nothing for them in this town, just like every other place they had passed through. It was a brief stop in a journey that had no real destination. But for now, it was enough. They had food, water, and the promise of another day. As they mounted their horses and began to ride out of town, the quiet behind them seemed to fade, replaced by the sound of hooves on dirt, the rhythm of their journey continuing. The town would be a memory soon enough, just another place where they didn't belong. But the road ahead, that was still open. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting long, stretching shadows across the desert. Samuel and Nara rode in silence once more, the quiet of the evening settling around them. The town was behind them now, a fading memory in the rear view of their lives. Another stop, another fleeting glimpse of civilization. But the road ahead remained uncertain, endless in its possibilities, both terrifying and freeing at the same time. Samuel kept his eyes on the trail ahead, the landscape blurring in the dimming light. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the chill of the evening and the faint smell of dust. He could feel the weight of the silence between them, and he knew Nara felt it too. She had been quiet since they left the town, the walls around her thick and impenetrable once more. She hadn't spoken since the exchange in the store, and Samuel didn't push. He knew better than to force words from her. But he couldn't help but wonder if she was thinking the same thing he was. Where was this journey taking them? Was there an end? Or were they both just doomed to run forever? He stole a glance at her, her dark hair flowing behind her like a cloak, her eyes scanning the horizon with that same cautious wariness that had become so familiar. She was a survivor. She had to be. But there was a weariness in her now, something that had slipped through the cracks in her carefully constructed defenses. It was there when she had looked at him after they left the store, the way her gaze lingered just a second too long, like she was searching for something, trying to make sense of what was happening between them. Samuel couldn't deny it. Something was changing between them. He could feel it, even if neither of them was ready to name it. They had come together out of necessity, two people who had nothing left to lose, two souls trapped in a world that had taken everything from them. But now there was something else. A connection, fragile as it was, had begun to form. "Do you ever think about where we're going?" Nara's voice broke through the quiet, her words almost lost in the sound of the wind. Samuel was taken aback by the question. He hadn't expected her to speak, especially not about something so personal. She had been so distant, so closed off, and for a moment, he wasn't sure how to answer. "I think about it sometimes," he said, his voice calm but unsure. "But I don't think we're meant to have all the answers. We're just supposed to keep moving." Nara's eyes flicked toward him, and for the briefest of moments, there was a flicker of something in her gaze, something that might have been hope, or maybe just a hint of understanding. "I don't know if I can keep moving," she admitted softly, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I'm tired. Tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of living like this." The vulnerability in her voice hit Samuel like a wave. He had heard it before, from himself, from others, but hearing it from her, from someone who had always worn her strength like armor, made it feel different, real. "I get it," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I've been running for a long time, too, but it's all I know, all I've ever known." The words hung between them for a moment, and for the first time, there was a shift. Samuel could feel it, an understanding, a shared truth that neither of them had been able to face until now. They were both exhausted. They had both been through hell and survived, but there was no real rest, no true peace. "You don't have to do this alone," Samuel said, his voice firm but gentle. "I'm not going anywhere." Nara didn't answer immediately, but her shoulders seemed to relax just slightly, a small weight lifting from her. The words weren't a promise, not yet, but they were a step, an opening, and for now that was enough. The road ahead was still long, and the future remained uncertain. Samuel knew that. He knew the dangers that lurked in the shadows, the threat of raiders, of bounty hunters, of the ghosts that followed them both. But there was something about this moment, about Nara, about the way they had come to understand each other, that made him believe they could face it together. They didn't need to know what the future held. They just needed to keep moving, together. The evening deepened into night, and the stars above began to shine brightly, scattered across the sky like a million scattered dreams. The desert, which had seemed so empty before, now felt vast and full of possibility. In the distance, the faint outline of a canyon appeared, and Samuel felt a tug in his chest. It was a place he had been through before, a place that would offer shelter for the night. "We'll stop there," Samuel said, pointing toward the canyon. "It'll be safer. We can rest for the night." Nara didn't argue. She simply nodded, her eyes never leaving the road ahead. Samuel could see that she was still lost in her own thoughts, but there was a subtle change in the way she carried herself. She wasn't as tense as before, not as guarded. It was a small change, but it meant something. It was a sign that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to stop running, even if it was only for tonight. As they rode toward the canyon, the night stretched out before them, the moon rising higher in the sky. The air was cool now, the breeze gentle and soothing. And for the first time in a long time, Samuel allowed himself to believe that they might make it, that they might find a way to survive this world, not just by running, but by standing together. The canyon loomed closer, the shadow of its cliffs dark against the pale light of the moon. It wasn't much, a place to rest, a place to gather their strength for what came next, but it was something, and for now, it was enough. The canyon loomed in the distance, its jagged edges etched against the deepening sky, like the teeth of some ancient beast waiting to swallow them whole. As Samuel and Nara rode closer, the air seemed to cool even more, the desert's harshness giving way to the shelter of the rocky cliffs. The sound of their horses' hooves on the dirt faded, replaced by the stillness of the canyon's embrace. They had found their refuge for the night, a brief haven from the long road they had traveled. Samuel pulled his horse to a halt at the entrance to the canyon, the narrow gap between the rocks leading them into the darkened depths. He dismounted with a groan, his muscles stiff from the long ride, and began to unsaddle the horses, making sure they were secure for the night. Nara followed suit, her movements precise and deliberate, as if the exhaustion of the journey hadn't yet settled into her bones. But Samuel could see it, the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her hands paused just a fraction too long as she tended to her horse. She was a woman who had learned to keep moving, to keep fighting, even when every part of her wanted to collapse. They were both tired, but there was something in the air here, something different from the rest of the desert. The canyon, though wild and untamed, felt safe, like a secret hidden in the heart of the earth. The wind whispered through the narrow gaps in the rocks, carrying with it the scent of earth and stone. It was quiet, almost unnervingly so, and Samuel couldn't help but wonder what dangers lurked in the shadows of the canyon walls. Once the horses were taken care of, Samuel gathered the firewood and set it up near a small outcropping, a natural shelter from the wind. He struck a match, and the fire crackled to life, casting warm light across the darkening canyon floor. The flames danced in the cool night air, flickering in the dark like the hope that had begun to grow between them. Nara sat a little apart from him, her back against the canyon wall, her eyes fixed on the fire. She hadn't spoken much since they'd left the town, and the quiet between them had become a familiar companion. There was a part of her that still held back, still kept her distance. Samuel didn't push her for answers. He didn't need to. He knew that when she was ready, she would speak. But for now, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared space, a place where they could both breathe. The firelight flickered on Nara's face, casting shadows that danced with every movement. She was different in the light, less guarded, but still distant. The remnants of the woman she had been before they had crossed paths, before the violence, before everything, were still there, buried beneath layers of pain and survival. Samuel could see it in the way she held herself, in the way she watched the fire burn, as if it could offer her answers that no one else could. After a long moment, Nara spoke, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "Do you ever think we could stop?" Samuel's heart tightened at the question, his eyes flicking toward her. He hadn't expected her to ask it, not yet. But it was the question that had been lingering in the air between them, the one they had both been dancing around, the one that no one wanted to face, but both of them needed to. "Stop?" he asked quietly, his voice low. "You mean stop running?" She nodded slightly, but her gaze remained fixed on the fire, her expression unreadable. "I don't know if I can keep doing this. This life, this endless cycle. I feel like I'm always on the edge of something, always waiting for the next fight, the next battle, always running." Samuel swallowed, his throat dry. He had felt it too, the weight of the constant fight, the constant fear, the weight of being a stranger in every place, never truly belonging, never truly being seen. "I don't know if we can stop," Samuel said after a long pause, his voice quiet. "But maybe we don't have to run forever." Nara turned her head to look at him, her eyes dark in the firelight. There was something in them, something he couldn't place, but it made his heart beat faster. It was a look of uncertainty, of vulnerability. For the first time, he saw her not as a warrior, not as someone who had learned to survive at all costs, but as someone who was beginning to question whether it was worth it anymore. "I don't know how to stop," she said softly, her voice fragile. "I don't know how to trust that the fight will ever be over." Samuel's chest tightened. He wanted to reach out to her, to offer some comfort, some assurance that there was an end to this road, that they could find a place to rest, to breathe, but he couldn't promise her something he wasn't sure of himself. "I don't know if we'll ever be free of the fight," he said, his voice quiet but steady, "but I do know that, for now, we're together. And that's something." Nara's eyes softened, the hardness in her gaze shifting just slightly, like a crack in the armor she had built over the years. "You're not like the others," she said, almost to herself, her voice barely a whisper. "You're different." Samuel didn't know how to respond to that. He wasn't sure what it meant, but he knew it was a beginning, a small step, a fragile thread of trust that had begun to form between them. "I don't want to be like the others," he said simply. "I don't want to be someone you have to survive." She didn't answer, but for the first time, she didn't need to. They sat in the quiet for a long time, the fire flickering between them, the desert night wrapping around them like a blanket. The journey was far from over, and the road ahead was still uncertain, still full of danger and shadows. But in this moment, they were alive. They were here, together. And that was enough. The fire crackled softly as the evening air turned colder, the canyon around them swallowing the remaining light of the day. The world felt suspended, like everything had slowed to a crawl. But in the distance, a sound broke the stillness, the faint rhythmic clopping of hooves. Samuel's hand instinctively went to his gun belt, but he didn't make any sudden movements. He knew better than to assume. It could be nothing, or it could be something worse. He glanced at Nara, whose face had gone pale under the firelight. Her posture had stiffened, every muscle in her body alert as she looked toward the entrance of the canyon. She didn't need to speak. He could see the same thing in her eyes that he had seen in his own reflection during years of running. It was the quiet panic, the understanding that danger was always just around the corner, waiting to find you. "We're not alone," Samuel muttered, eyes scanning the shadows. Nara's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't need to ask him who it was, she could feel it too. It wasn't a coincidence that they had just found shelter, and then, out of nowhere, someone else had appeared on the outskirts of the canyon. The hoofbeats grew louder, now unmistakably the sound of multiple riders. They were getting closer. Samuel stood up slowly, his eyes narrowing. He could hear the distinct voices of men now, their conversation low but unmistakable. "Get ready," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Nara was already reaching for the knife at her waist, her fingers light and practiced as she grasped the handle. She wasn't afraid of a fight. She had survived too many to fear one now. But even she knew that this might be different. They had nowhere to run. Samuel's heart raced, but his movements were steady as he checked his revolver, confirming it was loaded. He didn't want to draw attention to their position, but he also wasn't about to let themselves be caught unaware. The riders were close now. He could hear their low murmurs in the canyon, the jingle of spurs, the shuffle of boots on rocks. It sounded like at least 4 or 5 men, too many to take on in open combat, especially with Nara still recovering from her past, and him, well, Samuel wasn't sure what he was now. A man with a past. A man who had made a choice to stop running. The riders came into view at the edge of the canyon, silhouetted against the dimming light. Their figures were sharp and imposing, their horses large and well-fed. They were no ordinary travelers. "Look at that," one of the riders called out, his voice rough but amused. "What do we have here? 2 strays lost in the desert." Samuel didn't answer, keeping his hand resting casually on his gun. He had learned that when it came to men like these, sometimes silence worked best. The man who had spoken spurred his horse forward, a burly figure with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. His eyes flicked between Samuel and Nara, his lips curling into a grin as he surveyed them. "Don't reckon I've seen you two around before. You're a long way from the nearest town, ain't you?" Nara's eyes flashed with a warning, and Samuel could feel her tension, but he kept his expression neutral. It was better to let the man talk, let him show his cards first. "We're just passing through," Samuel said slowly, his tone steady but his mind racing. "No need for any trouble." The man's grin widened. "Trouble? Nah, we don't want no trouble. But there's always something interesting about people who wander out here alone. You never know what they're hiding." The others laughed, a low, dangerous sound that echoed off the canyon walls. The leader, who had spoken first, gave Samuel a long, appraising look, his eyes narrowing slightly as he sized them up. Nara moved slightly, adjusting the knife at her side, but it wasn't a threatening movement, just a calculated one, a sign that she was ready if this went south. Samuel wasn't sure if he should draw his gun now or wait for them to make the first move. Before he could decide, one of the riders in the back of the group gave a sharp whistle. "Hey, you two planning on giving up anytime soon? Or are we going to have to make this interesting?" Samuel's heart skipped a beat. They were already circling them, moving into a tighter formation. It was clear now that this wasn't a friendly encounter. The leader's casual tone, the way the men were inching closer, it wasn't going to end peacefully. Samuel's fingers tightened around the grip of his revolver. "We're not looking for trouble," he repeated, though the words were beginning to feel less convincing by the second. The leader laughed again, but it wasn't a warm sound. It was the sound of someone who knew they held the upper hand, someone who was enjoying the fear in his prey's eyes. "Well, you sure found trouble," the man said, and in an instant his hand darted to his holster, drawing his gun with practiced speed. "And I reckon you've got something I want." Nara was already moving, her knife flashing in the dim light as she lunged toward one of the riders who had moved too close. Her movements were fluid, precise, but as she struck, the rider twisted, catching her wrist in a vice-like grip. "Damn it!" she spat, but she wasn't done yet. Samuel saw the desperation in her eyes, the fight in her, and knew she wouldn't stop until the last man was down. In the same moment, Samuel's hand was at his side, drawing his revolver in one smooth motion. The shot rang out just as one of the riders reached for his knife, and the man dropped, his blood spreading across the dirt beneath him. Another rider moved forward, but Samuel was already there, his fist connecting with the man's face in a brutal punch, knocking him off balance. It was chaos, a blur of movement and sound. Nara's knife flashed again, finding its mark in another man's side, and the canyon was filled with the sound of grunts, shouts, and the harsh clatter of hooves. The leader fired again, but this time, Samuel was ready. He dodged to the side, rolling behind a large boulder as the bullet grazed the rock. His heart pounded in his chest as he peered over the rock, watching Nara expertly disarm the last rider, her knife flashing with lethal precision. The leader, realizing he was outmatched, backed up, his eyes darting to the canyon walls as though searching for an escape. "No more games," Samuel said, his voice cold. He rose from his cover, his revolver aimed at the leader, steady and unflinching. The leader's hand twitched toward his gun, but he didn't draw it. For the first time, he seemed uncertain, his bravado fading as the weight of the situation sunk in. "You'll be wise to leave," Samuel said, his voice low and commanding. "And if you know what's good for you, you'll forget we were ever here." The man's eyes flicked to the bodies of his men, then back to Samuel, and for a moment there was a dangerous silence. Finally, he backed away, hands raised in defeat. "This ain't over," he muttered. But he didn't challenge Samuel. He turned and spurred his horse, retreating down the canyon, his men following closely behind. The sound of hooves faded into the distance, and the stillness of the canyon returned. The tension in the air slowly ebbed, and Samuel lowered his revolver, his heart still pounding in his chest. Nara stood silently, her eyes scanning the area, her knife still in her hand. She wiped it on the sleeve of her jacket and turned to Samuel. "Is it always like this?" Samuel's breath slowed as he holstered his gun, shaking his head. "No, but it sure feels like it." And for the first time in a long time, Samuel felt a strange sense of relief. They had made it out of this together. And maybe, just maybe, that meant they had a shot at surviving whatever came next. The canyon, once filled with the tension of an imminent battle, had returned to its quiet, ancient stillness. The wind whispered through the rocky walls, and the fire crackled softly as the last of the embers danced in the night. Samuel and Nara stood in the aftermath of the skirmish, both breathing heavily, the adrenaline still coursing through their veins. They had fought hard, and they had won, but the victory felt different than it ever had before. It wasn't just survival, it was something more. Samuel scanned the canyon, his eyes lingering on the bodies of the men who had tried to take them down. They were scattered in the dirt, their lives ended in an instant. It was a reminder of the world they lived in, one where violence was a constant, where trust was a luxury few could afford, and where the line between life and death could be crossed in the blink of an eye. But in this moment, he wasn't thinking about the men who had fallen. He was thinking about the woman standing beside him. Nara was different now. She wasn't the same woman he had found in the desert, broken and wary, afraid to trust. There was something in the way she held herself now, something quieter but stronger. She had fought with everything she had, not just to survive, but to protect what little hope they had left. And Samuel had felt it, in the heat of the battle, in the way they had moved together, watching each other's backs. He had realized that this was no longer just about getting by. It was about something deeper, something worth fighting for. She didn't say anything as she wiped the blood from her knife, but Samuel could see the weight of the fight settling into her. He could see the exhaustion in her posture, the way her eyes had dulled with the toll of it all. She wasn't invincible. No one was. And yet, in this moment, there was a flicker of something that neither of them had expected. Hope. They had survived this, together, and that was something worth holding on to. "We made it," Samuel said, his voice quieter now, the adrenaline starting to wear off. Nara glanced at him, her gaze steady. "For now," she replied, her words tinged with the quiet truth they both understood. It wasn't over. It never was. But for tonight, they had won, and that was enough. Samuel nodded, his eyes following hers as she looked out into the canyon. It was a beautiful place, in its own way, the jagged cliffs and the vast sky above. But it was also a place of solitude and of isolation. It was a reminder of the road they had traveled, of the journey they were still on. The road wasn't going to get any easier, but at least they were together. And maybe, just maybe, that meant they could face whatever came next. They set up camp again, the fire crackling in the silence between them. The night was cold now, the chill of the desert air creeping into their bones. But there was a warmth between them, an unspoken bond that had been forged in the heat of battle. They didn't need words. They didn't need promises. They had already shown each other that they were willing to fight for something more, something that went beyond survival. As the fire burned low, Nara settled beside it, pulling her knees to her chest as she stared into the flames. Samuel sat across from her, his eyes flicking between her and the shadows of the canyon walls. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know where the road would take them next. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like there was something worth holding on to. Not just survival, not just running, but something deeper. "Do you ever think about what's next?" Samuel asked, his voice quiet as he broke the stillness. Nara looked at him, her eyes searching his face for a moment, before she replied, "All the time," she said softly. "But it's not about what comes next. It's about what we do now." Samuel nodded, understanding her words more than he could explain. It wasn't about the destination. It was about the choices they made along the way, the people they became, and the battles they fought, not just with the world but with themselves. He didn't have the answers. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring or whether they would ever find the peace they were searching for. But for tonight, as they sat by the fire in the quiet canyon, he knew one thing. They had each other, and maybe that was all they needed. Nara leaned back against the stone, her eyes tracing the constellations above them. She was lost in her thoughts again, but there was a calmness in her now, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. Samuel watched her, knowing that the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but also knowing that for the first time, they didn't have to face it alone. In the distance, the sound of a coyote's call echoed across the canyon, and Samuel smiled softly to himself. The world was vast and the road was long, but for now, they were here, and that was enough. "Tomorrow," Samuel said, breaking the silence again. "We keep moving." Nara didn't say anything, but she nodded once, her eyes never leaving the sky above them. Tomorrow was uncertain, just like every day before it, but they had survived another night, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like victory. As the stars shone brightly overhead, the fire slowly burned down to embers, and the canyon swallowed the night around them. Samuel knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, and that, more than anything, was worth fighting for. The road ahead may be uncertain, but as long as they have each other, Samuel and Nara know they can face whatever comes next. Every battle, every step, brings them closer to something more than just survival. If you found strength in their journey, if you believe that even in the darkest times, we can still find a way forward, make sure you don't miss what comes next. Subscribe now and join them as they keep moving forward together, because every fight deserves to be witnessed.